Okay, should be getting started here. Let me see. Okay, I see some people are already here in the chat. Hey, good evening, everybody. This is episode 59 of the, well, I don't have the name yet, but it's This Week in Tech for now, I guess. But apparently there's another show that already exists on YouTube called This Week in Tech that I found out about a couple of weeks ago. So we'll probably rename the show at some point if it really blows up or gets large at any point in time. But already kind of brainstorming some replacement names. But anyway, we do this show every Thursday evenings. So we talk about all things in tech, specifically related to the PC DIY space. So anything that's related to building a PC, whether it's for gaming or content creation, or high-end desktops or workstations, or even just playing out as a hobby. Because believe it or not, there are people out there that don't really play a lot of games. They pretty much just build PCs, and they might dabble in the overclocking space as a hobby. So it's basically all of the above. We cover all of that on this channel. So if you like this sort of content and you're new to the channel, do subscribe, because we do answer a lot of questions live. So if you do have questions, if you're a new to PC building, we have a growing community with a Discord channel. A lot of people in there are really helpful with advice for those that are new, myself included. And then if you have a question and we're live, we can answer the question live. So with that being said, we have a couple of things to talk about this week. Not a lot of things that are that new. Intel finally did address the stability things. I put out a video on how to mitigate that problem on a 3900K, because it's usually the i9s that are running into the problem. We'll talk about that first, and then we'll probably get into some of the other articles here later. We do want to talk about the new ROG Ally X. I don't know why they're not calling it the Ally 2. I don't really know why they're naming it that way. And then other things like Ghost of Tsushima, there are Nvidia drivers out for that game. I think that game comes out next week, if I'm not mistaken, on PC. It's the Director's Cut edition, so it's basically the full version with all the DLC. And that's pretty much it. So, how are you guys doing? Interesting week. Nvidia leaked 5090 specs. Didn't we already kind of have leaks about that, though, for a while? Is there another story about that? Hey, Matt, you got I saw your message yesterday. So you got 7900 GRE from Shadow. Oh, it's that one? Okay. 2024 year of convoluted naming schemes. I don't know if this is the only year of that. I feel like a lot of products have already had that problem. I don't think this is the first year of that. But this is definitely a year that is, I feel like gaming kind of like, because we do cover games on this channel, not to the extent of like an IGN or a GameSpot or one of those channels that are like dedicated media outlets to gaming, but because of the nature of PC building and how when you test stability, usually there's a correlation between gaming on PC and building high-end PCs. So we do cover gaming to an extent, but what I've observed is the vast majority of all the games that are kind of your AAA titles, they pretty much are all coming out in the first half of the year. There's not a whole lot in the back half of this year, at least as far as I'm aware, unless you guys are aware of some games. I mean, I know there's that Wukong, Black Myth Wukong. That's supposed to be a UE5. I think it's UE5 titles. But other than that, there's not a whole lot. So that's good, because if you're saving up money to build a PC later this year, because there will be a lot of interesting options in the second half of this year. Spoiler alert, there's a lot of new platforms that are launching later this year. In a couple of months, we're going to start with one of them, and then it's just going to be all downhill from there. But that's good news, because you don't have to spend money on like the gaming side. So you can like save money for the hardware side if you're wanting to upgrade. That being said, compared to last year had a lot of like big AAA titles. There's just a lot of games that came out last year. So I feel like this year is kind of that off year. And then I think 2025 we'll see a lot more big name titles. Like I know there's a Monster Hunter game next year. I think GTA 6 is coming out, but it's like console only. But yeah, not many games for the second half. The rumor is based off of what we already saw. Oh, you're talking about the 5090? Yeah, I don't know about that. Well, we'll look at that. We'll definitely look at the 5090 stuff in a little bit. But the first thing I wanted to address here, because I did a video, I think it was like a week ago or almost 2 weeks ago now. I put a video out on helping people how to actually, I made a video a long time ago, like back when the 13900K first launched. This would have been like October 2022. So this is like a year and a half ago now is when this CPU was brand new. I already showed how to run this CPU in eco mode because it wasn't as clear on how to do it compared to the AMD processor, because like all the big YouTube channels, they kind of covered how to do eco mode. I know Gamers Nexus covered how to do eco mode on the Ryzen CPU, but nobody ever did that for the Intel CPU except me. I mean, I was like the one guy that put out a video on this channel, you know, how to enable eco mode on a 13900K. Well, it turns out that video aged very well, because anybody who did that, who followed that video, they would not be having this problem that everybody's complaining about with instability now. So I made a newer version of that video about 2 weeks ago on the channel, basically with the newer BIOSes, just how to do the exact same thing, how to basically turn on eco mode, or how to enforce Intel's baseline TDP power, which is the 125 watt power limit 1, and the boost thermal velocity, whatever you want to call it, the 253 watt power limit 2. So that was something that I feel like, the one thing about this story, I don't understand how so many motherboard manufacturers can get this wrong. Like, I know Hardware Unbox recently did a video showcasing the enforced Intel limits on an ASUS motherboard. That video is completely invalid now. It has no meaning, because the test is invalid because they were using ASUS settings which don't actually follow Intel spec. So to follow Intel spec, according to Intel, these are all the parameters that need to be modified to match the actual default setting. So this depends on whether you have a 13 or 14900K or KF. That would be this middle table here. And if you have a KS, you have the lower table down here. Now, I don't think, I know this stuff, supposedly this screenshot comes from Intel, but to me, the KS specs that Intel's showing is actually wrong. They've actually shown the wrong info for the KS. They're showing the correct info for the K SKUs and the KF SKUs, but they're showing the wrong info, and I can prove that using Intel's own product spec website. So this is wrong, and we'll look at the correct ones. But anyway, if the easiest thing is, if you don't want to have to look for all these different settings in the BIOS, although some of them, depending on your motherboard, may or may not easily show or expose all of these settings. Although I think if you have a newer BIOS now, they're forced to show all of these settings to the user. So I don't know. I have not updated my BIOS to the latest one, and I have a Z790 Aorus Master, which is the one that the video is based off of. But I'm running an older BIOS, and I was still able to set it to Intel spec. But we'll talk about that. Basically, if you don't want to do all this stuff up here, all you have to do is you have to make sure that SEP is turned on, and the eTVB is also enabled. And then other than those two, all you got to do is set PL1 equal to 125 if you have a 13900K or a 14900K. and then set PL2 to 253. Now, this other one is news to me. PL limit 4. I don't know what PL4 is. I've never heard of it until seeing this chart. And this raises the question, if there's a PL1 and a PL2 and a PL4, where's PL3? You know, like, I don't know who to believe at this point, but all I know is that from my point of view, the easiest thing to do is to literally just go to Intel's website, like, just do a Google search for 13900K, go to the website, scroll right here, and look at this. Processor-based power means PL1, 125. So PL1 needs to be 125. Maximum turbo power is PL2, and that's 253. So that is basically how to set Intel to run at the default spec. That is the default spec. There's no reason to do undervolt. You don't have to do undervolt. The problem with undervolts are they can introduce instability if the chip is not a very well binned CPU. So I don't recommend undervolting for that reason. I'm not saying you can't do undervolting. If you are going to do undervolting, you kind of have to understand. You have to understand that you have to stability test the system, because if you just change power limits like this, basically if you do what I show in the video, you don't have to test for stability. It's just straight up going to work. If you undervolt the CPU, you have to go back and test the stability, because you could still end up crashing, not because the system is using too much power and it's unstable at those certain voltages on that curve, but because it doesn't have enough power, it doesn't have enough voltage to run at those frequencies. So that's the reason why I don't recommend undervolting, because it requires extra steps in terms of testing for stability, and that depends on the CPU, because everybody's CPU is different. Every CPU has its own voltage frequency curve, and if I show how to undervolt, I can already tell you people are going to copy paste my settings, and then some people are not going to have a stable CPU because theirs is a lower bin part or whatever. You know, so that's why I don't showcase undervolting, because it's not something that is plug and play. You can't just copy somebody's undervolt and expect it to work. You might get lucky, it might work, or you're unlucky and it doesn't work, and you have to go and figure out what your stable undervolt is. But if all you do is set the power limit, you don't have to do any more changes, and you don't have to test stability, because if you're running it at the base spec, it should work. If it's not working at base spec, then you probably have to do an RMA, because the CPU is probably defective or it's damaged due to the, you know, the current draw, the high temperature, whatever it may be. That's I don't know who to blame, because it's like Intel's trying to push the blame on the motherboard manufacturers. The motherboard manufacturers are saying, hey, Intel told us we could do it. So, you know, like, how can we be held accountable for this? Yeah, but the problem is, it doesn't seem like it's consistent across the board, and every motherboard manufacturer has their own standard of what they think the Intel-based specification is. So it's kind of a huge mess. Your CPU is also undervolted because the AC-DC load line is not correct. Look at CPU Z. The what? What do you mean? The load line is not correct. You mean something in here? If your AC is 50 and your DC 90, your CPU is undervolted? What? Wait, what are we talking about? It is undervolted in stock settings, which is insane. Is it? Because it pulls a lot of power at stock. Typically, undervolt doesn't pull that much power. If it was undervolted at stock, then I think... Because what is this PL4? What is this 380 watt PL4? I've never heard of this. This is the first time I've ever heard of this. Load line calibration? Oh, you're talking about V-droop though. V-droop is not undervolt. Undervolting is different from V-droop. V-droop looks like an undervolt, but V-droop is not an undervolt. You're saying the undervolt must match the LLC? So, hold on. So when you overclock, or not overclock, let's not say overclock. Let's just say we've got voltage, and then this is the load. This is the load percent. So as the load increases, so what we're talking about here is something called load line calibration. As your load increases, so as the percent of utilization on the processor goes up. So for example, when you load up Cinebench R23 and you do a multi-thread, multi-core run, that loads the CPU to 100% full load. Now what happens with the voltage is the voltage will go down. As the loading increases, the voltage will go down. It will actually go down. This is what is referred to as V droop. Voltage droop. That is what this is. Because it is a reliability feature. It is a self-preservation feature of the CPU. Because if the voltage stays very high at full load, 100% load, the CPU will become damaged, because what ends up happening is all the transistors will be active, and the amount of current that will flow through everything needs to, like if your current stays constant, right? Your voltage has to go down. That's the V droop. Because your current, and also there's another thing too that we haven't even addressed, and that's the current draw. The current draw, because I have a theory, or I'm hypothesizing that the reason why this is an issue that's cropped up recently is because the 14th gen CPUs are already overclocked to the max. They're basically factory overclocked 13th gen CPUs. Now the 13th gen CPUs are starting to fail because they're aging far more quickly. PC Perspective talked about this. Josh Walrath from PC Perspective, he did a whole section on one of their podcast episodes. This was a few months ago. They were talking, this was back in March. They were talking about I think they were talking about how like the Sandy Bridge CPUs were very nice overclockers, and you could put lots of voltage on them and they survived for like 15 years or whatever. You know, even though I think they're not even, wait, how old are those things? 2011? Yeah, they're not even 15 years old, but they were exaggerating. The point is, those CPUs didn't have a problem with reliability because they were not overclocked out of the factory, and the user could choose to overclock them or not. And they were, because they were so, I don't want to say undervolted, but because they ran at such reserved voltage levels, we'll say that, or I guess moderate voltage levels, at stock, they had a very long lifespan. They were questioning whether or not the current generation CPUs would have the same lifespan because they were pushed so hard from the factory. Like, because the default behavior has such high current draw and high temperatures. Like, because, think about it, like, the Intel thermal throttling temperature is like 100 degrees Celsius. It's definitely not 100 degrees Celsius on a Sandy Bridge. I think Sandy Bridge thermal throttles at like 80 or like 75 or something. Like, it'll just thermal throttle at that way, way lower temperature. But these CPUs, they accept up to 100 degrees Celsius. What I find mind-boggling is the fact that if you look at the overclocking guide, it literally says that you can raise the thermal throttle temperature to like 110 C or 115 C, and the absolute maximum where it shuts off is like 120 or 125 C. To me, those are ridiculously high temperatures that are definitely, if you run your CPU close to those temperatures for an extended period of time, you're definitely making that CPU knock on death's door, because I don't care. It's like the silicon is just not going to last long term with those type of temperatures. You know, that's just too much. So this is VDroop. So what was the whole thing about the LLC? This is basically LLC, load line calibration. Load line calibration is what controls the relationship between VDroop and the load percentage. That's what load line calibration is. So I think probably some people that are subscribed to this channel have seen my Ryzen optimization video. In fact, I want to make a newer Ryzen video on how to overclock the X3D, because I think that video has some things that I wanted to say differently pertaining to the LLC. Go to CPU Z. You want me to go to CPU Z? Okay. Let me pull up CPU Z. I don't think this is going to be very useful. We'll go into CPU Z. Here, I gotta share CPU Z. Where is it? And you'll soon learn why I don't think this is going to be very useful. There. This isn't going to be very useful to what we're talking about, although it's still a CPU. This is not the CPU that's related to the problem. So this is the CPU Z. There's CPU Z. This is why I didn't want to show CPU Z. Because we're talking about an Intel CPU, but we're not streaming on an Intel-based system. We're using an AMD system. So anyway. So I guess, hold on. Let me... That was showing the browser, so I need to go back to the Opera browser. It's like, oops. I've got the wrong CPU. So it's not really going to show us much here. Anyway. It's like we're talking about VDroop on Intel. Well, the same principles apply to AMD, but the AMD doesn't have this problem. So because it doesn't do, I mean, it's the weird thing is this. So the thing with this is I don't want to tell people to go and use LLC calibration, because like if they want to do, for example, less VDroop, they can do that. The problem is when the CPU stops running at full load, over here, we would have to kind of like zoom in right here. But at low load, you actually get voltage spikes. You get these little micro voltage spikes. So if you're running a higher load line calibration profile, like if you have extreme or turbo or something where it's almost at the zero line, which means it's actually adding voltage instead of letting it VDroop. It's adding voltage. The LLC is basically adding voltage to offset the VDroop. The problem with doing that is when the high load ends and it drops back to like idle or low load, you end up with these transient voltage spikes at the lower load. Because remember, here, this is high load. Over here is like low load. So at low load, you get voltage spikes. And that can be bad for the CPU long term. That's the reason why I kind of wanted to redo that video, because I think I did mention I don't recommend running an extreme LLC. I would recommend like level 3 typically out of the max level. So if the max level is say level 5, I would only do like level 2 or level 3 in terms of LLC. But that's what I would recommend. So I may redo that video showcasing LLC on an X3D CPU, because that is basically how you overclock an X3D CPU, because you cannot apply the traditional OC mode. You cannot change the V-core directly on an X3D CPU like you can on a regular CPU. So, but that's the LLC. But Yeah, the other thing too is the current. They never really talked about the current draw until this whole fiasco with people having issues with stability. I mean, I think there was one story where someone was at like a Counter-Strike tournament and their PC like literally blue screened while they were in the competition. And at first they tried to blame it on an RTX 4080, and I think that's how the whole Nvidia blames Intel thing got started, because that whole thing happened and then Nvidia basically said it's not our fault. It's actually your CPU's unstable and it's Intel's fault. So they pointed them at Intel, and yeah, that's how that whole thing happened. But yeah, anyway. The simple answer is if you go into the BIOS, the bare minimum settings that you have to change are PL1 and PL2, and I have a video on how to do that. And if you have a 13900K, you set PL1 to 125. It's literally on their website. And you set PL2 equal to 253. It's on their website. And if you have a KS, the only difference is, here we go to 13900KS. This one, the only difference is PL1 is 150. So literally, a 1300KS is a factory over volted, I guess, because it has a higher power draw, which means it has higher. It means, see, anytime you see a higher wattage, like for example, 1300KS says PL1 equals 150. That's the actual Intel official spec. And it says 1300K is 125. So that tells me that this way, they guarantee that the 1300KS will use more power because PL1 is 150 watts. Is that the idle state? No, that's not the idle state. That is power. That is the PL1. And the other thing too is these things have they have durations in terms of how many seconds. They have something called the tau value, which determines how long it will run at PL2 versus PL1. So PL1 is the fallback. So basically, you could think of PL1 as this is like your long duration, all core wattage. So if I'm doing a Cinebench run, and I show all of this in the video, if I'm doing a Cinebench multi-thread run, it'll start out at PL2. It'll attempt to run at 253 watts. However, it will then run. It'll then do a check as it's running. It will do a temperature check and will also do a duration check, because it's only allowed to run at 253 watts for a specific period of time. If it hits that time limit and the Cinebench run is still running, it will throttle back to PL1. It'll actually drop to PL1, even if it's not thermally limited. The alternative is it's doing the Cinebench run and the cooler is not good enough to handle the CPU at 253 watts. So because of that, it'll shoot up to like 100 degrees Celsius or whatever. And then it'll be like, oh, I've hit my thermal limit. It'll level off back to the base power before it hits that duration that it's allowed to run and not exceed for the PL2. So that is the behavior with Intel's Boost algorithm. That's how it's designed to work. Now, the way that these processors have been running from launch is not the way I described. The way I described the processor just now, that behavior is the official Intel behavior of the CPU. That's how it's supposed to behave. However, all the motherboard manufacturers released these unlimited power, the Emperor Palpatine meme, unlimited power. Like literally, they set the PL1 and the PL2 equal to 4,096 watts. They basically make it unlimited because obviously the transistors, the CPU itself cannot physically pull 4,096 watts. So that's why, hence it's called unlimited power. But if you were to fire up like Hardware Info 64 or some monitoring application that would pull the values from the BIOS, you would clearly see, as shown in my video, 4096 or 4095, depending on your motherboard, as the actual power limit. So when it's set that high, that completely invalidates the time duration limit for PL2. Because think about it, if it's 4096, that basically tells the system, hey, you can run for 4096 watts for up to some amount of seconds. So, however, it runs, let's say the limit is like 15 seconds. So for 15 seconds, it tries to pull 400,096 watts. Then after 16 seconds or whatever, it's like, hey, timeout, you've exceeded the time, Cinebench is still running, so now you have to level off. Well, guess what? It'll level off to the base power, aka PL1, but PL1 is also set to 4,096 watts. So it completely invalidates the thermal throttling, or not even thermal throttling, it completely invalidates the power limit boost algorithm from Intel. It just completely overrides it and negates all of it. And that is kind of the problem with this unlimited power. And when I got one of these on launch day back in 2022, I looked at mine and I was like, wait a minute, 4096, that's wrong. So that's the reason why I made that how to enable eco mode on 1300K. It wasn't really an eco mode. I didn't know what to call it back then. I literally named it eco mode, but I didn't know that what I was really doing was enforcing Intel's specifications. That's basically what I did. So yeah, that's how you fix the problem. It's a problem that, as far as I'm concerned, should have never existed. But I guess they had to do it to be competitive, or whatever the reason was. I don't know. It certainly doesn't make the product look like a good product. AC load line affects voltages on auto voltages. It does this by boosting the voltage target to the VRM. DC load line does not affect operating voltages and the voltage identification definition, but DC load line is best set to the same value as the VRM load line for accurate voltage identification definition. So in Intel, it's on default? What do you mean? AMD's is... So AMD... I'm trying to remember. Like, AMD's basically... Okay. AMD's is... only looks at temperature primarily. Although that's the first thing. We actually did a good discussion on this. I think it was in the previous live stream. I might need to take that section from that stream and make it a separate video clip. Because I don't want to go into the AMD one again, because we already covered the entire AMD one in depth on the last live stream. Intel's is on by default, but if you're running it off of the unlimited power BIOS, it's not on at all. I mean, it's there, but it doesn't actually do anything. The only way to make it work is to actually enable these numbers based off of the CPU. That's the only way to make it work. So, this is basically all you need to do, though. At a bare minimum, you have to set PL1 and PL2 to these numbers. Like, that's all there is to it. Like, there's all this other stuff. They talk about, like, ICC max, SEP, the TVB, thermal boost velocity. Yeah, all those things they should be on. I think for most BIOSes they are on, although I don't know. You can never trust these motherboard manufacturers for some reason. Like, when it comes to the Intel BIOSes, it's kind of all over the place. I will say that the reason why this is a problem on Intel, and it hasn't really been a problem on AMD, is because AMD exercises way more control and regulation over the BIOS. So a lot of people may not know this, and we're going to talk about that now, I guess. So this is load line. We don't need this anymore. So Intel's BIOS UEFI, I mean, it's basically like there's like a single package, and that's basically it. So they publish the specs, they publish all the parameters, they make it available to the motherboard manufacturers, and the motherboard manufacturers have access to write their overlays and however they want to showcase the different settings. That's how it is. AMD's BIOS is very different. AMD's BIOS UEFI, there is, so within this one, and I guess most people are familiar with something called AGISA. AGISA. AMD generic encapsulated, now I'm drawing a blank. I want to say system agent, but I don't think that's correct. System architecture or something like that. I think, I don't know, is the last word architecture? I think it is architecture. AMD generic encapsulated system architecture. You guys can Google this for me and correct me if any of these words are wrong. But this is a black box. So I've often said this on previous streams. So this is kind of a black box that the motherboard manufacturers have very little control or visibility into. So then there's also the package overlay and the SMOOS, the system management unit. Intel's has that, and then Intel's has the SMOOS. So basically, when you look at it, Intel has one major component. The AMD BIOS actually has two components. There's that, and then there's the traditional one. AMD generic encapsulated software architecture. Okay, I was close. I said system, but it's actually software. So I got most of it right. Okay, so software architecture. So anyway, the point is, the AMD one has something called AGISA, and this thing is largely unmodifiable by Gigabyte, ASUS, MSI, ASRock, BioStar, Lenovo, Dell, etc. None of them can make changes to the AGISA. It's in that way, it's like a black box. So I've said this before, and I'll say it again. Intel CPUs are similar to Radeon GPUs in terms of like how open the control is of stuff like the software stack. In this case, we're talking about firmware on the CPU side. But like Radeon GPUs, for example, anyone who works with Linux knows exactly what I'm talking about. So Intel CPUs, the user control, or I guess the system integrator or the AIB level of control over the overall product is a lot more open. They have way more control over it. So that's why I always think of Intel CPUs as being similar to Radeon GPUs. Meanwhile, AMD Ryzen CPUs are similar to GeForce GPUs. Now, people are probably like, what? What is he did he just say that AMD CPUs are like Nvidia's GPUs and Intel CPUs are like AMD's GPUs? Yes, I did say that because that's actually true. Nvidia uses, like Nvidia's DLLs and their driver stack is very much a closed ecosystem. In that regard, it is very similar to the AGISA. There's not a lot of control over it. You can't do much with it. Like Matt's saying lockdown. Exactly. That's exactly what I'm trying to display here. So the GPU, the GeForce GPUs are way more locked down. You have far less control over what you can do with them compared to the Radeon GPUs. Likewise, Ryzen CPUs are far more, I don't want to say locked down because that makes it sound like you can't overclock, and you absolutely can, but from a firmware standpoint and a quality control standpoint, if we're talking about AGISA, think of AGISA as like a black box in the BIOS that the motherboard manufacturers, they can interact with it via API calls to the different functions that exist in AGISA, but they cannot modify it. They cannot write their own extensions to AGISA. It's a closed system, just like NVIDIA's driver stack. That is the reason why. What's almost ironic in me saying this is overclocking Ryzen is actually kind of like overclocking GeForce, and overclocking Radeon is kind of like overclocking an Intel Core. So when you think of it that way, it makes even more sense, but that's not exactly what I'm trying to I'm not trying to make it, I'm not trying to make that direct comparison. But I think you guys understand what I'm saying. So the Agisa thing is basically not edible, or I guess not edible. What am I trying to say? You cannot edit it. If you're like an ASUS or an MSI, you can't go into Agisa and change stuff. And that's the reason why I think AMD doesn't really have this sort of problem with inconsistent behavior across different motherboards and different brands and how they make the boost algorithm work on the CPU. Because basically you can buy an ASUS or a Gigabyte board or an MSI board. They basically all function the same on Ryzen. Now, they do have control over the voltages, but not really, because a lot of it is kind of controlled by the built-in PBO preset for the voltage frequency curve. So you can adjust things like LLC and those sort of things. When you make changes to the load line calibration on an AMD CPU, you're interacting with like one of the system management units. So you're doing stuff that's in here. You're not really doing anything with the Agisa. So just keep that in mind. Intel says so in the Intel recommendation, OC load line. Power limits only solve the heat problem. Power limits, well, yeah, I see what you're saying, because even if your power limit is 253, you still aren't controlling the micro voltages, like the random transient voltage spikes and the amount of current that's being pushed. So yeah, and that's the reason why they basically publish this entire table of stuff. Like, that's the reason why all this stuff exists. Like, all this stuff about never exceed 400 amps and make sure that current excursion protection is turned on. Yeah, all that stuff. I mean, that stuff that should have been like day one spec. But obviously the motherboard manufacturers didn't follow the rules, or I guess they didn't follow the guidelines. So I don't know. Like, I have a feeling that anybody who bought like a Dell Alienware doesn't have this problem. Because I'm pretty sure the OEM system integrators like Dell and HP and Lenovo, like their gaming, like pre-built desktops, are probably following most of these guidelines. Maybe like 80%, 90% of these guidelines are they've probably been following them all along. It's the other guys. It's like your typical Z790, you know, or like Aorus Elite, or your Z790 Maximus, or your Strix, or your ASRock Steel Legend, or your Tai Chi, or your MSI whatever the Intel one, the Ace. I guess they also have the Ace. Like, yeah, that's the problem. Like, those guys don't follow the same standard across the board, and that's the problem. And that's the reason why I was talking about Agisa, because AMD has that Agisa thing, and because they have that, it's like everybody just follows the same standard, and that's why you don't see this problem. But on the Intel one, it's kind of an open field. You do whatever you want, and they're all going to try to outcompete each other by messing with these settings so they can look better in the benchmarks. Because you guys saw like Gigabyte's baseline versus ASUS's baseline, completely different results. You know, like one is significantly higher on the bar charts than the other, and that's because the one who's doing that isn't following the actual spec. Which motherboard brand do you trust most? Like, I would say they're pretty much all about the same. There are none of them are perfect. I'll tell you this, none of them are perfect. Like, I have had motherboards from all four major brands. I've never owned a BioStar motherboard, but I can tell you I've had ASRock, MSI, Gigabyte, and ASUS. I've had all four of them, and none of them are perfect. All of them have their quirks. If I was going to recommend one to someone who doesn't know anything about PCs, there are specific go-to models that I would just blindly choose. So, and it depends on the brand, because within all 4 brands, there are go-to random motherboards that I would recommend for someone who knows nothing about building a PC. I would just pick those because I know that those are kind of the safest ones. Like, they're not going to be super expensive. They're not going to have underperforming VRMs. They're going to have the things that actually matter, like M.2, enough M.2s, and RAM capacity, whatever. So it just kind of depends. Like, I've done builds for people I know, and I've gone with like MSI recently, even though I personally am not using an MSI motherboard this generation. I've gone with, like, currently I use a lot of Gigabyte boards, but I also have ASUS and I have ASRock. You would go with Gigabyte on AMD or Intel since they have certain models that are good enough. Yeah, I'll tell you guys, I'll just kind of like randomly... See, I don't want this to turn into like a random product placement video, but I'll just kind of give you guys a couple of my like random go-tos. So, X670 Aorus Elite AX. This is kind of a good one. It's an easy one to recommend. It basically does everything you need. It has everything. It's got 4 M.2. It has no lane sharing, so there's no problem. Because, like, the thing is, I'm thinking of it like this. If I'm helping build this PC for someone who knows nothing about PCs, I don't want them to, like, spam me saying, hey, how come I bought another M.2 and now GPU-Z says I only have 8 lanes of GPU. Like, what's going on? Like, what happened? Or, hey, I bought a 4K capture card and I plugged it in and I can't find my game SSD anymore. Like, my game SSD doesn't show up in Windows. Like, I don't want to be troubleshooting those problems. I already know the answer to all those problems, and those problems deal with lane sharing on the motherboard. But I know that this motherboard doesn't have any lane sharing. So there's no way that those problems could happen. You know what I'm saying? So I can avoid those sort of problems. Another one that's really good is the Steel Legend. Steel Legend, if you want all the PCIe Gen 5 lanes, Steel Legend is an excellent board. It is an ASRock motherboard. So the top one is a Gigabyte. This one is an ASRock. Those are really, really good ones. The Intel ones, so the Z790 Gaming X from Gigabyte, or I guess maybe the Aorus equivalent of that, or the Aero equivalent of that. That's also very similar to that Aorus Elite one. So it just kind of depends. And these are not super expensive either. Like this one, these are both like less than $300 motherboards. Like these are in the $200 price range, which means they have good VRMs. They have all 4 M.2 slots. There's no lane sharing. You basically get everything that you could possibly need. You have your X4 slot. So if you want Thunderbolt, you can add Thunderbolt. If you want to add USB 4, you can add USB 4. If you want to add 10 gigabit networking, you can add 10 gigabit networking. So it's like they basically get the job done. So I basically would recommend stuff that is in the $199 to $299 price range. This is what I consider the range where you get the most for your money. Anything outside of this, like if you go under $200, then you're probably going to get a board that's lacking certain things. If you go over $300, you hit diminishing returns, or you're buying for a specific use case. Like you have to have USB 4, or you have to have Thunderbolt, or you have to have some specific thing that the $300 price range doesn't include. So yeah, these are kind of my default, either the AMD one or the Intel Z790 equivalent. Like this is kind of my go-to. The other one that I will mention is, I guess for MSI, the Carbon, but actually Carbon's kind of expensive. So I would say MSI Pro. I think it's Pro, not RS. RS is a ASRock one. MSI has like a Pro something. I forgot what it's called, but MSI has something. No Godlike or Maximus Extreme. Yeah, no. Not for someone who knows something about building a PC. I think those Godlike or Extreme. It doesn't matter what spec you have, ICC max to 400, and with the power limit, you can adjust so that it doesn't get too hot. Well, I can tell you, like, the power limit, so if you guys do this, wait, not this. If you do this, just doing this, setting your CPU to follow just what's shown here, meaning even if you don't mess with ICC max and SAP and all those things, if all you do is do what I show in the video, you're not gonna like ever hit 100 degrees anymore. And by the way, like the video was showcasing the temperatures on an air cooler. Okay, so when I made the video with the 1300K, that's on an air cooler. This is not a liquid cooler. And with these settings, I never hit 100 degrees anymore. So and that's without doing anything with the current. And that's on an air cooler. I have to stress that. That's on an air cooler. So if I do the current stuff, like ICC max, 400A, amps, whatever, SAP, TVB enable, all that stuff, eTVB, turn all that stuff on, then it'll probably perform even like worse than what was shown. But I can probably go back and test some of that. 360 AIO. My 360 AIO is on a 7800X 3D. I only have one 360 AIO. It's the one that I did in the live stream. Or the one that I did. You guys saw, if you guys were watching the live stream last weekend, I basically, what did I do in that video? Oh, I took a 12700K and retired it for a 7800X 3D. And so the 7800X 3D now has the 360, the Deep Cool LT720. Meanwhile, this has an air cooler. So do all the big 16-core Ryzen CPUs. And the Threadripper has an air cooler. So it's like, why does the 8-core Ryzen 7 get a 360 AIO and all the big Ryzen 9s and the big brother Threadripper and the 1300K, they're all sitting on air coolers? You're like, maybe my priorities on the CPU cooling side is wrong or something. But yeah, so the I guess that kind of answers that. Air cooling is just so much lower maintenance though. Like I don't have to worry. Like I can sit here, I don't have to worry about the pump dying. I don't have to worry about the fact that water will slowly perforate through over a long period of time. So the pump will become less efficient over time. Whereas the air cooler, the only way the air cooler is going to become inefficient is if you literally let the dust, you remove the dust filter from the outside of the case and you just let it get clogged with dust. That's the only way that could possibly happen. But you clean it up and it's like, you're good to go. So it's like, air all the way. Air cooling for the win. Max is right. 100% agree. Air cooling is the way to go. Like, here's the thing, guys. Here's the thing. If I am helping a friend, so this goes hand in hand with the question that you guys were asking earlier. Like, what do I recommend? Like, I'm thinking of, for someone who knows nothing about building computers, you know, like, I'm just thinking in my own mind what I would assist or what I would recommend they go with. You know, like a motherboard in this price range because it hits all the check boxes for value for money. Next, I would give them an air cooler. I don't care what the CPU is. It's going to get an air cooler. No liquid cooling. No AIO. Never. Not for someone who knows nothing about PCs. Because I have seen too many instances of pumps failing, people complaining about like whining noises after having the system for like 6 months. They start complaining about like these weird whining sounds, pump whine, whatever, you know, like or worse, leaks. That's like the worst possible one. I mean, that's very rare, but I know Twitch streamers that have had their AIOs leak while on stream and they go offline because their CPU, they're basically shorted out something. So there are instances of Twitch streamers like literally their PC dying because the AIO literally dies while they're live. So I'm like, yeah, no, for a streaming PC, I need 100% uptime. No, it's like no way. For short bursts, whatever, some like casual gaming machine or whatever, like a 7800 XUD, yeah, put a liquid cooler on there, whatever, or like a test bench, put an AIO on there. I would never use air cooling if I was doing a test bench. I would use the AIO because it's way easier to swap RAM. It's way easier to pull the GPU out. But you need good airflow in case for air cooling, right? Well, I mean, you still need good airflow for liquid cooling. It's the same for both. Like, if you're gonna build a PC, you're going to optimize the airflow regardless. Like Nicholas is saying, it's not any different. It's like if you build a PC with an AIO and you have very bad airflow, your AIO is not going to perform very good. In fact, your AIO is going to be louder. The reality is the AIO with poor airflow is going to be louder than an air cooler with poor airflow. Because the fans on an AIO, they typically run, I think they're rated for like 2400 RPM. So if your fans on an AIO ramp to 2400 RPM, that system's going to be loud. That's the other reason why, if I'm helping someone build a PC for the first time, I recommend air, because I know the air cooler is going to be quieter. So they're never going to complain to me about their computer being loud or making weird sounds. Or like, why does it have this whining sound? Why is there a ticking sound when I turn it on? You know, like, no, you don't run into any of those problems if you're using an air cooler. And you have peace of mind that there'll never be a leak, that there'll never be a pump failure, etc. And your pump is going to be loud and die quick. Well, it happens. Well, think about it. The reliability of the pump, though, guys, do you guys know that a liquid AIO pump runs at like 3450 RPM? It's like anywhere from like 3000 to 3450 RPM. This is how fast the AIO pump runs. If you have a good AIO, this is the speed range that it runs at. If your pump is running at like 2000 RPM, you have a lousy, like that thing's gonna not, no, it's not good. So that's how fast they run for an actual good one. So that is going to cause noise, like a whining noise. If you put your ear next to the AIO, you're gonna hear it. So meanwhile, air coolers, the fans run up to like 2400 RPM. So this is loud. Just FYI, this is not quiet. Meanwhile, air cooler fans run up to like 1800 RPM. That is significantly quieter. So, air cooling is quieter and lower maintenance than liquid. No matter what. Because as soon as you start like running, if you're just playing games, so the thing is people are like, oh, well, if I'm playing games, the AIO will be quieter than the air cooler. That's not true at all, because if all you're doing is playing games, both of them are going to be quiet. Like, that doesn't change anything. Like, if you run the CPU at full load for something like video rendering, for example, this is going to be way louder than the air cooler, because when you're video editing, like when you're rendering videos in DaVinci Resolve or something, man, this thing's going to like 2000 RPM on the fans. So it's still going to be loud. Arcade's talking about the custom loop, but the custom loop invalidates like all of this, because the custom loop is completely different. Like that's like on a whole nother level. Like we're not comparing custom loop. You know, that's a whole different class of automobiles right there. 420 is around 1 to see better. Yeah, and it's way more expensive too. You know, I was looking at the ASUS ProArt 420 AIO. The deal breaker on that was that it was almost $300 and it doesn't support Threadripper. That to me is like how can you make a 420 AIO for the ProArt line and not allow it or not support Threadripper when Threadripper is pretty much the ultimate CPU for that sort of workstation? Like, what? That's like a clear misstep on ASUS's part. Yeah. Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. Yeah, he's right. It's single digit improvement. But anyway, going back to this. So, what I wanted to say here, well, I guess we're kind of done with this. Yeah, if you limit the power and you don't change anything with the current, you could still have too much voltage or too much current to the CPU, but because it doesn't boost for the same duration, it's probably going to be fine if you do the power limit. So anyway, let's move on to the next one here. So the next one is, we're probably going to do this one relatively quick. So ASUS unveils ROG Ally X or 10. I don't know. I don't think this should be pronounced 10 because there's only like one ROG Ally. So I don't know why they didn't just call this the ROG Ally 2. But the successor to the ROG Ally, I think Steam is supposed to come out. Valve is supposed to release a newer Steam Deck, if I'm not mistaken, at some point soon. But this supposedly fixes the overheating memory stick or whatever. Wasn't there like a problem where the first generation, because of where the fans were on this, it was cooking the... I think, don't these use an SSD? I think it's something where like the SSD was overheating or something. I forgot the story now. But basically, this is supposed to address that problem. Lenovo Legion 2 is reportedly in development as well. Yeah. What do you guys think of the Lenovo Legion though? Like the handhelds. What is your favorite handheld? Like if you have a handheld, or if you're thinking of getting one, what is the one that you would consider getting? Or if you already have one, which one do you have and why? Because I'm curious to know, like, which ones are the ones that are actually have high user adoption. Yeah, if you were to get one. Legion Go. The Ally. See, I was thinking the Ally myself, until I found out about the issue with the overheating of the memory stick for VRR. Oh, you get the Ally for VRR 120 Steam Deck OLED. The only problem with Steam Deck is the thing that makes the Windows based ones more ideal is the fact that you can play like all the games that don't run on Steam, but they require Windows on the Ally or the Legion. You can't do that. I mean, you can on Steam Deck, because Steam Deck uses Linux. There's workarounds and there's extra steps. And then sometimes, depending on the game, the compatibility is questionable. So I'll give you guys a good example. Like, because the reason why I'm going to say this is because I know a lot of people have messaged me asking me, like, if they buy a handheld, can they play Genshin Impact on it? So, and I didn't even know, because I didn't even bother to look up much into the handheld market until that question came up. So I was like, okay, well, let's think about this. The Steam Deck is Linux-based. Genshin Impact is a mobile game that also runs on Windows. So I assume you can run Genshin Impact on an ROG Ally or any Windows-based handheld. No problem. But I don't know about Steam. Like the Steam Deck, that one is questionable. You know, same thing with like Star Rail and all those other live service games that are not on Steam. So it's like, I don't know. I think I've seen like a YouTube video of somebody running Genshin Impact on an ROG Ally. So I basically told that person, hey, you know, here's someone running Genshin Impact on an Ally. So that's probably the one to get. I don't know. Like, there's probably a way to get it to work on Steam. Like you'd have to probably, can you dual boot Windows on the Steam Deck, or is there not enough memory to do that? Like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Like, it's more complicated on Steam Deck. Lenovo generally. Oh, wait, HP Omen has one. Oh, the Transcend. Man, these names. The Transcend. The HP Omen Transcend. What about the MSI one? Didn't MSI have one? What was the MSI one called? The MSI Claw or something? What was the MSI one? The one that had the Intel thing in it? Was it MSI Claw? I keep thinking of the name Claw. MSI Claw was right. Oh, wow. MSI Claw. What a weird name. That name is so weird that it actually works. It's expensive. Poor performance. Bad Meteor Lake. Oh, that's where all the Meteor Lake CPUs went. They went into the MSI Claw. The MSI Flaw. Yeah, because you don't hear anything about that. Like, was that short-lived? Do they still make it, or is it already discontinued? AMD has to enable support because mobile graphics can't use... Oh, you're talking about the... someone says something about FSR. A lot of people using FSR3 mods on their Ally. See, okay. We've talked about this in regards to DLSS and the Nintendo Switch and the Switch 2. Like, that... Okay, upscaling makes the most sense on a handheld console. Like the Ally, the Switch, the Steam Deck. Those platforms can benefit the most from FSR and DLSS. Way more than your typical gaming desktop ever would care to benefit from. Because at that small screen, at that small little screen, you're not going to notice the weird artifacts. You're not going to notice the weird upscaler doing its upscaling things. It's not as noticeable to the user. And think about that. Those synthetic frames, they're not going to eat up the battery life the way a true frame does. So those synthesized fake frames, that like helps extend the battery life while also making the game way more fluid. So yeah, like the FSR3 stuff on the Ally, that's an excellent example. I mean, we talked about this last year when we were talking about Switch 2 rumors. And here we are in 2024, still no... Come on, Nintendo. Like, where's the Switch 2? What's going on? The PS5 Pro is already on the way, and we don't have no like indication of when the Switch 2 is coming out. I just saw a story recently somewhere about the Nintendo right here. No, that's not it. Where's the... Yeah, right here. Nintendo Switch 2 will be unaffected by chip shortages. Nintendo won't commit to a 2025 release. So, okay, by the time this thing comes out, it'll already be irrelevant. Like, it'll already be outdated. Like, what is going on with the Switch 2? Here we have Ally X, Legion the Second, and whatever, and the Steam Deck 2 or whatever. All this stuff's in development. Meanwhile, we got the Nintendo Switch 2, which we have no idea what's going on. All I know is that it's supposed to be using Nvidia's Ampere, so it's supposed to be like an RTX 3050 Max Q or something. Is that right? Or is it like worse than that? Does anybody remember what the Switch 2 is supposed to have in it? It's like an SoC based off of Ampere 30 series Nvidia or something like that. No, yeah, it's not going to have frame gen because it's Ampere. But it can support DLSS. It should support DLSS because it is based off of Ampere, and Ampere supports DLSS. So, in fact, DLSS 2. So this thing will launch with DLSS 2, and the world will be good, and it'll be fine. But the problem is, we don't know when it's coming out, and I feel like because Nintendo is taking so long to do anything or like to announce anything. Or there's like nothing. There's like no rumor. There's nothing. It's like, what's going on? There are rumors that the Switch will be unveiled this fall and released in the March of 2025. Okay, well, I hope that's the case. Switch 2 is more likely to move to full cloud gaming. Does Nintendo have the infrastructure for that, though? That's the thing. Like, cloud gaming for handhelds actually makes more sense, even though everything about it will be worse. You know what I mean? Like, they're on Wi-Fi, so they don't have a LAN connection, so that's already going to introduce latency and packet performance problems, and like with buffering and stuff. Then they have battery life, so they're underclocked. So it's like the local system is already kind of limited. So it's weird, but I do think that handhelds can benefit from cloud gaming a lot better than like a traditional desktop. Cloud gaming will offload a lot of the heavy lifting, so you should have significantly higher battery life on a handheld if you're using it for cloud gaming. There's a Logitech cloud gaming handheld. What is that for? Like, what's the platform? Is that like a GeForce Now thing? They'd probably make a partnership with Nvidia. See, that's kind of what they need to do. That's actually a really good idea. Because does anybody use GeForce Now? I know Nvidia always talks about adding things to GeForce Now, but I don't know anybody who actually uses GeForce Now. Like, you hear about it every now and then, but like no one I know is using it. So it's like, is it really relevant? You've heard of people using it? Do you know anybody that uses it though? That's the thing. Like, I kind of tend to use my own connections to see if something really is taking off. Like, the best example I could give you, back when Palworld was in early release. When Palworld first came out in early access, everybody was playing it. I knew about it because people I know were telling me about it. You know, that's how I knew that this is popular. If people around me are not telling me about something, and I'm having to go and like find the answer myself, then it's questionable whether or not it's actually mainstream. But I don't know anybody that uses GeForce Now. I mean, I know a lot of people that have Game Pass, but I don't know anybody that has GeForce Now. Because to me, GeForce Now is like Google Stadia and all those cloud things that didn't really work. You know someone who has Nvidia Shields? Man, the Nvidia Shield is super old. That thing is from like... Didn't the original Nvidia Shield come out more than 10 years ago? Do I have that right? I'm thinking of the little... Didn't the Nvidia Shield look like an Xbox controller with like a thing that popped up with a screen or something? It was a cool looking device. It was a complete flop, but I remember it. I remember you could buy those at Fry's Electronics. They have the Shield. So the Shield has the Nintendo Switch processor. Man, so the Switch is that bad. Like, that is super old. Oh, you're thinking about Shield Portable? Yeah, I'm thinking about the Shield Portable. The only time you see people using it, you're referring to? You're referring to the Nvidia Shield? Oh, or GeForce Now. Fangs of Yima just subscribed. Thanks for the sub. Yeah, that's something that I always thought of getting. Like that little Shield Portable thing from Nvidia, never got it. I do have a Switch, but I haven't used it in a long time. It's just because every time I pull out the Switch, it's like, I just think, man, I wish this thing was an ROG Ally or like something modern. You know what I mean? Because this thing is from 2017. This thing is, what, 7 years old? 7 years old? Remember, Sony says that a console has a 10-year life cycle. So technically, if we're going by Sony's way of thinking, and I know Nintendo's not Sony, so these rules don't really apply to Nintendo, but if we're going by Sony's perspective on consoles and their lifespan, the Switch only has like 3 years left, which means there's always an overlap. Remember, there's always an overlap. So look at the PlayStation 4. The PlayStation 4 came out in the fall of 2013. So here, let's go back to this. We're gonna do the timeline. Delete all this, so we don't need any of this anymore. So a console is supposed to have a 10-year lifespan. We'll start this in 2013. So, and then I guess we have to do 2014. Anyway, the point is, PS4 launched in the fall of 2013. So we have, what is this, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. I should have made this smaller. 22, 23, and then we have now. So you guys get the point. So the point is, here, in the year 14, 15, 16, 2016 in the fall, PS4 Pro. Then we have 2017. Switch. Switch launches in 2017. I think it was like March of 2017 or something. So that was when the Switch came out. So Sony says 10-year lifespan. So 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23. So right here, last year, 2023, guess what? 10 years. Your time is up. Notice how there's no games that are coming out for PS4 anymore? Have you guys noticed that? All the games that are coming out now are PS5 and Xbox Series X only. The developers are not making their game. Now, I'm not saying like everybody's like that, but the vast majority of games that are coming out since last year are not really coming out on PS4 anymore. You know, like Lords of the Fallen. It's not on PS4. Horizon Forbidden West. Isn't that one like PS5 only? And now it's on PC? So the newer games are not coming out on PS4 anymore. So this is why I go by a 10-year lifespan, because Sony themselves say the consoles have a 10-year lifespan. So when did the PS5 come out? 17, 18, 19, 20. Here we go. Everybody's favorite era, especially if you're in the market for a GPU. At the end of this year, or the end of 2020, PS5. Oh, by the way, Xbox Series also launched, and also Xbox One was back here. I guess we should include Xbox. Let's not leave them out. And I'm trying to remember. Okay, in this year, Xbox One X. The Xbox One X was in the same year as the Switch. So meanwhile, oh, it is a cross-gen, but the DLC isn't. Okay, but remember though, Horizon Forbidden West was a 2022 game. Horizon Forbidden West came out in February of 2022. So technically, that was not the end of the PS4 yet. Because technically, PS4 was like last fall was that 10-year lifespan. So that's the reason for that. But the point is, we have now gone... Look at this. 1, 2, 3. So there was a 3-year gap between the base PS4 and the PS4 Pro. Now we have now gone 1, 2, 3, And it will be 4 years between the PS5 and the PS5 Pro. So that is different from the previous generation. There has been like a lag time between, a longer amount of time between the PS5 and the PS5 Pro compared to the previous generation. So, and I don't think Microsoft, well, we already know Microsoft is moving away from consoles. So, and I think Sony is now starting to do their strategy in moving over to PC as well. We all know about the whole Helldivers 2 situation. I'm not going to talk about that on this channel, but because I don't play the game. But I mean, that was a huge thing. That was Sony's attempt at pushing their overlay, their link your PSN with your Steam and all this stuff. Now, it remains to be seen what they're going to do with Ghost of Tsushima, because it has already been talked about that Ghost of Tsushima will require the PlayStation, whatever they're going to call it, the PlayStation Network overlay / you have to link your account or something. So whatever they tried to do with Helldivers and then they backtracked on what they said, they're going to try to do that with Ghost of Tsushima. So I don't know if they're going to not require that or they will require that. I assume that they are going to do the latter, that they are going to require it from day one. And because it's not a multiplayer live service game, I think they're going to be able to get away with it this time around. You're interested in the PS5 Pro? Probably because it'll be the most powerful console ever made. I'm going to be getting one. I mean, I'm tired of waiting for the Switch 2 at this point. I'm just like, okay, bye. I'm just going to get a PS5 Pro instead. That way, I can play GTA 6 when it comes out with the best experience. Because that's going to be a console exclusive for like a year or two, or who knows how long. Because GTA 5 was 2013 on the consoles. It was a console exclusive for, I think, like a number of years, actually. Oh, no, actually, GTA 5 was a PS3 and Xbox 360 game, which then got support for the newer consoles, I think, the following year or something, or 2015. It didn't even come to PC until 2015, if I'm not mistaken. So, it could end up being a long wait, but I don't think it'll be the same amount of time to wait. I feel like with the console market shrinking year after year, the amount of time that a game is a console exclusive is also shrinking, which means it'll come to PC faster than it did last time. At least I think that's the case. So that's the Switch 2, which leads me into this one. Ghost of Tsushima, Director's Cut. We don't need to talk too much about this because we just talked about it, but it's coming soon. The latest Nvidia driver already mentions that it has it, which basically means that somebody at Nvidia got early access to the game to play test it for a couple of hours and verify that the latest driver, it doesn't crash in the latest driver or whatever. But the reality is, most of the time, you can still be on an old driver and it'll still work. Like, you don't have to upgrade your driver every single time a new game comes out. Because think about it like this. When the developers were porting over the game, they were doing that like who knows how long ago. It could have been a year ago. It could have even been 2 years ago when they began work on that. And guaranteed the game ready driver didn't exist a year ago or 2 years ago. So whatever they were testing the game on at the time, it had to run stable, otherwise they had to fix whatever bug it was on the game. So that's why you don't always, every time I see this, like, oh, the game ready drivers, blah, 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 it's like, yeah, maybe you have to update the driver, but it's like a recommended thing, but it's like an optional thing. You don't have to update the driver just because a game is checked off. That basically means that somebody played some of the game on this driver and they didn't run into any problems, so they signed off on it. They said, yeah, this is good. And that's basically how they do it. It just means they didn't test it with the other one, like with the older driver. Studio driver is better. It's I wouldn't say that. No. The studio driver, actually, I don't think it has that many things. I don't think it has all the same things that the game driver has. Like, I know you can't do... There's some stuff that you cannot do while you're in the game with the overlay that you can do on the game driver, but you cannot do on the studio driver, if that makes sense. So, I wouldn't say the studio driver is better. It's just meant for a different audience. Like, okay, let's put it this way. If you're primarily using your PC for gaming, you want to be using the game driver, not the studio driver. If you're using your PC primarily for other things that are not gaming, then the studio driver is the one you want to be using. Studio driver is meant for devs. I don't know if it's for devs only. I think it's more for people that are doing stuff with 3D graphics and stuff like that. But I recommend the game driver. The studio driver is more for... it's not for the professional cards. That's a completely different one. But it is definitely not the one you should be using if you're using the computer for gaming. The gaming driver is the way to go. That doesn't mean that it won't work. I mean, it's just... It's not... It's using it for the wrong use case. So, but yeah, I recommend the game driver. So that was... Okay, so we covered the ROG. What else did I want to talk about? Oh, I guess the last thing I wanted to talk about was the DDR5. Somebody was asking me... Someone left a question on the DDR5 video asking about the different, like, how to get the 4 sticks. The thing is, I can't believe... I made like 3 or 4 videos now about DDR5. And the answers are in the video, but either people are not watching the video completely, or they're not, or it's like there's parts of the video that they skip through and they don't see the information. Because everything that was in the question that I see in the comments are answered in the video. So, just to kind of go over this, I guess we don't need this anymore. DDR5 overclocking. So the question that I got was, so this individual originally built a PC with, I don't remember the processor. It was some kind of Ryzen 7, or I don't know if it was Ryzen 9. It was a Ryzen CPU. And they had an X670E Meg Ace from MSI. So they have this motherboard. And they bought originally 2X, well, I think it was 2X32. I think so. The way they worded it, I wasn't sure. The way they made it sound was they bought like a kit, but they said like 32 gig. So I don't know if that means 2X32 or if it was 2X16 for a total of 32. This was not clear to me. But the point is, they bought some RAM, whatever. It was like 32 gigs or something. And then they went and bought like another kit. And then they said that they couldn't run it at the same speed. So it's like they loaded Expo 6000 and it works. Then they went and did like 4X32 and they ran into the problem. They ran into a problem where it was like they got the blue screen of death, IRQ error, something like that. This was what the comment was saying. When they ran the four sticks with the Expo 6000, and so they were running into a problem. So that to me means he didn't watch the video because I talked about this in the video. In fact, there's another video that I did from January that was addressing a similar amount of memory. Did you hear? Yeah, I saw that article. Yeah, so that's good that they're doing that because it sounds really weird saying 6,000 megahertz or 8,000 megahertz. I mean, everybody who knows anything about overclocking RAM knows what I'm talking about. But occasionally I'll say like 8,000 megahertz, and then someone will be like, it's not actually 8,000 megahertz. It's like, okay, I know that. It's 4 gigahertz. I know that. Because DDR5 or DDR memory, basically, if this clock speed is 4 gigahertz, the memory operations are happening on the rising and the falling edge. So this is the DDR. This is the DDR. It's the double data rate. Twice per clock cycle. That's why it says 8,000 mega transfers. But anyway. Changing to MT and Task Manager. Yes, that's going to show up probably in the fall. I don't think it's going to happen real soon. I think. Or maybe there's like a Windows Insider preview build that already has it. But anyway. So this person was having this problem. So I told them, even though the answer's in the video, this requires manual changes to ODT. To the ODT settings. Voltage will not fix this problem. On-die termination will fix this problem. So there's a couple of parameters I wanted to bring up here. So the first one is proct ODT, also known, I think, in the BIOS as PODT. No, I don't think it's actually listed like that. I think it's listed as proct ODT. So this parameter, this option has existed since Zen 1. In fact, I don't know, maybe it even existed before Ryzen, but it has existed for a very long time. At least first gen Ryzen has had this. So this stands for processor on die termination. So this basically means that it is a resistor or it has an impedance value which runs counter to the voltage and the current. So to understand what this is, you have to understand the relationship between voltage and current and resistance. So the voltage, there's a mathematical formula. Voltage equals current, which is abbreviated I, times the resistance. So when you have voltage, you have voltage in volts, you have current in amps, and you have resistance in something called ohms. So, because I've gotten so many comments about, like, I don't even know what this is. Like, what is that? I don't know what this is. Like, I get all these comments like, what is that? I don't understand ODT. What is ODT? I don't know what this is. Like, I don't know what that is. Like, what is this? Like, I don't know. I don't understand the video. It's like a cool video, but I don't understand what's going on. So we're going to answer this because it's like, I'm tired of those comments. It's like, I don't mind the comments. I mean, it's good for the YouTube algorithm. And, like, keep putting those comments in there. Like, I don't know what ohms are. But it's like, there's so many comments about this, or what is this, or what is ODT? Like, I don't understand. Like, what does it do? Like, what is ODT? So there is and so I got to looking on the internet when it comes to overclocking, and to no surprise at all, there is very few videos, or very few even internet articles, or even people on overclocking forums talking about this. Nobody ever talks about this. That's the reason why nobody seems to know what it is. So when I'm talking about it in the video, people are just kind of like, it just glazes over them. Deer in the headlights. They don't know what's going on. They're just like, okay, whatever. They like blank out for like 2 minutes of the video, and then they come back to the conclusion. Then they go and try to like do what I did, and it's like, it's not working. Like, oh, it's getting a BSOD IRQ error. 28 gigs of RAM. I can't get my 128 gigs of RAM running at 6,000. What's going on here? Well, the problem is, so when you have let's say we got the CPU. So we have the CPU, and then we have okay, do we need to do the Infinity Fabric? I guess we do need to have the Infinity Fabric in here. Do we want the Infinity? Let's forget about the Infinity Fabric. Let's just say we got the CPU and we have the RAM. We have all 4 sticks, because the only time this ever comes up is when people are running 4 sticks of DDR5. It's no one ever asks me about this when they're running 2 sticks. It's always a conversation about 4 sticks of memory, and it's always DDR5. It's always DDR5, and it's always 4 sticks of memory. And it's almost always dual rank DIMMs, which means that the individual is running either 128 gigs of RAM or 192 gigabytes of RAM. Or soon, people are probably going to be running 256 gigs of RAM. So the question is just going to keep on coming back over and over again. But when the signal is sent to the RAM, there is a resistance. There is a resistive value that it's used to modulate the signal as it traverses through the circuit. So there's a resistive value here. So you basically, you're going to have a plus and a minus. So you're going to have some voltage across this resistor. But the overall resistor value is going to be measured in, it's going to be an R value, and it's going to be something called RZQ, actually. Man, somebody defined that in my live stream the other day, and I forgot what it was already. But anyway, RZQ equals 240 ohms. And ohms, the unit for ohms is omega, the Greek letter omega, but I'm using Paint, so I don't have access to the symbol for omega. But anyway, the point is, you guys know what I'm talking about. So anytime you see RZQ, it basically means some resistance value or some impedance value. It actually means 240 ohms. So wherever you see RZQ, remember in your mind that it means 240 ohms. So it's actually very convenient that I'm streaming on a Ryzen computer, because the Ryzen computer actually has access to something called Zen timings. And that's what we're going to share next. So where is this one? Is this Paint? Oh, that's Paint. So we can't use that. So where is Zen? Here it is. Okay, so here is Zen timings. So this is my computer running right now. You can see the mouse. So this is Zen timings. So the cool thing about Zen timings is you can use Zen timings to figure out, for any given Expo or XMP profile that you apply, you can figure out what your motherboard programmed the tertiary and the sub-timings, as well as the primary timings, but the primary timings are typically the ones that you see on the RAM kit. And then also other interesting things like voltages, for example. But notice down here in the bottom right, what is all this stuff in the bottom right? We have proct ODT, which we just talked about. That stands for processor on-die termination. Oh, notice there's the Greek letter, the Greek capital letter omega. This is not a voltage, and it's not a current value either. It is an ohm. It's a resistance value. This is a resistor value. So the secret to running 4 sticks of DDR5 at higher speeds, aka 5600 or 6000. I mean, maybe you can do higher than that, but I personally haven't bothered to go beyond 6000 with 4 sticks of dual rank. But the secret in enabling the system to run stable with that much RAM in all 4 DIMM slots is the resistor values. It's actually the resistor values. It's not the voltage. So you guys can notice, you guys see here, I'm running 96 gigabytes of RAM as shown in the video. So my voltages are kind of low. You can see VSOC. Everybody wants to put 1.3 volts. That's way too much voltage. You don't need that much voltage. I can do 192 gigs of RAM at 1.2 volts VSOC. So it's definitely not the voltage that is needed for the stability. Like you guys can see, I'm only running 1.35 volts on my VDD, my VDDQ, my VDDIO. All this stuff is only like 1.35. In fact, my CPU VDDIO, I can probably lower that to like 1.3. I don't even think it needs to be that high. But anyway, so these are the voltage values in the upper right. But the lower right is actually what matters if you're trying to run a bunch of memory. Like 4 sticks, 128 gigabyte minimum. This is what makes or breaks the stability. So notice here, this first one, 43.6 ohms. That is the proc ODT. That's like the main one. You could think of this one as like the equivalent of the VSOC for trying to get RAM stability. Then proc CADS. This stands for a processor. I'm trying to remember what CA is, but it's DS stands for drive strength. This is the drive strength. So the DQDS is another type of drive strength. Now notice it says high Z. High Z. Z is the symbol for, or the variable symbol for impedance. So where R is ohm, or R is the resistor value, Z is the impedance value. And the way that the impedance value is measured, it's more of a measurement of the amount of electrical flux through, or it's not the measurement, it's the measurement of how much opposition there is to the flow of the electrons. So that is why it's known as the impedance, because it's impeding the flow of the electrical current. It's literally like it's causing friction. It's slowing it down. It's like a bottleneck. Although I probably should not have said that, because now people are going to start thinking of CPU and GPU bottlenecks, and that's not what we're talking about. So when it says high Z, it means high impedance or high resistance. And then the DRAM drive strength, 40 ohms. So these are actually kind of low. These numbers are very low resistance numbers. But down here in the bottom right, there's RTT nominal write, RTT nominal read, RTT write, RTT park, RTT park DQS. So notice all of these in the bottom corner say RZQ. RZQ means 240 ohms, like we said earlier. So this is 240 ohms. So if it says RZQ divided by 5, that literally means 240 divided by 5. And what is that number? 48. That's the reason why in parentheses, Send Timings automatically does the math for you, and it says 48 in parentheses, which basically means my RTT nominal write value is 48 ohms. Likewise for all these other ones, 240 divided by 5, 48 ohms for the nominal read. RTT write, 240 divided by 1 basically equals 240, hence why 240 is in parentheses. So this one right here proves that RZQ means 240 ohms. But all of these are resistor numbers. So what we want to do with the resistance is we want to, it becomes a balancing act for stability. So there's two things. There can be either high impedance or low impedance. There can be high Z, like we just saw on one of those, or low Z. And impedance and resistance, you can think of them as almost kind of the same thing. So anytime I say impedance, it also implies that we're talking about a resistor, because it's always going to be an ohm value, not a voltage value. But this is the key to getting 4 sticks of DDR5 working properly if you want to try to run at high speeds like 6000. It's the only option with the current technology, with the current motherboards, with the current DDR5 memory kits that are on the market today, and the IMC on the CPU. Now, the reality is the Ryzen CPUs, their IMCs are pretty good compared to Intel's. Like, as I showed in my video, I could run, in one of my videos, not the one we're talking about with this 4 sticks of memory, but in one of my videos, I literally show that if you want to run 8,000 megatransfers RAM, it's plug and play. You literally put it into a X670 motherboard, you turn the XMP profile on, and that's all you got to do. Manually set VSOC to 1.2 if you want to like regulate what the motherboard chooses. But that's basically it. That's it. Meanwhile, now I was trying to make an Intel video. I was trying to make a 13900K with 8,000 DDR5. I could not get it working. It's not plug and play on Intel. Like, and this is 2 sticks of memory. This isn't even 4 sticks of memory. And I don't know if my IMC is just straight up bad, because I know Buildzoid has had very bad IMCs on his Intel CPU. I mean, you've seen, anyone who watches Buildzoid knows about all the rants that he does on complaining about Intel's memory controller. So Intel's memory controller is very, it's very touchy. It's very bipolar. I don't know how to describe it. It's like, so sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. Like, you might get it to post, and then it just corrupts your OS the next day. So it's just really weird. But I got mine to post like one time, but it was not stable. It would not go to Windows. It like instantly wanted me to go into recovery and like do a system restore. And I was like, no, we're not going to be running with this. So I couldn't make that video, unfortunately. I don't know if it's my IMC. I don't know what the problem is. I know it's not the RAM, because the RAM works on 3 different AMD processors on 3 different AM5 motherboards. 1 ASRock and 2 GB. And it works on all 3 of the boards. It works on 3 different AMD CPUs. I tested a 750X, a 7950X 3D, and a 7800X 3D. And all of them work, so I know it's not the RAM. So that leaves only 2 problems. It means that either the IMC on my Intel CPU is garbage, or the $500 motherboard from Gigabyte, the Z790 Aorus Master, is garbage. And I don't really think it's the motherboard, because Z790 was supposed to fix like all the overclocking issues with DDR5 on Intel. So I don't know. Maybe I'll revisit that in the future. But I just know that I spent hours wasting all that effort trying to make a video about it, and I got nowhere. And I was just like, okay, this is not happening, apparently. So, but anyway, impedance is the key. Impedance is the key if you want to run 4 sticks of memory with high density. And there's 2 things. There's high and there's low. When you have, let's separate these out. So when you have high impedance, let's say you have the source and you're transmitting to the RAM. So when the impedance is high, the signal strength, if the signal strength starts off here, it will go down in strength, in drive strength, as it traverses through the wire, because the resistance is high. The impedance is high, which means the electron flow will be slowed down, or it means that it's going to attenuate your electrical signal. So when the impedance is high, if it's too high, what happens? The signal starts out and it doesn't make it. It doesn't make it to the finish line. It literally like dies before it gets to the other end. So you have to retransmit. And maybe on the retransmit, it barely manages to make it. So if you run the impedance at a lower value, you get better signal noise ratio, or you just get better signal strength at the other end. At your receive side, it's able to make it to the finish line. So the problem with high impedance is the signal becomes weak faster. So the integrity of the signal can be compromised if with high impedance. Now let's talk about low impedance. So I guess this is high impedance. If you have low impedance, it means that you have very little resistance. So if your resistance is too low, what ends up happening? So if I can send data, but the resistance is so low that there's like literally nothing to soak the signal, I could get a reflection. It could bounce back. It could bounce before it reaches to the other end. So this is the difference between high and low. With high impedance, you lose signal strength. With low impedance, you get something called reflections. So what is the downside of high impedance? High impedance means DRAM will run hot, overheating, thermal throttling. This is what happens when you have high impedance. Or these are the negative things to take into account when running high impedance. However, with high impedance, the signal quality, the signal receive value tends to be better, so your error rate is low when you have high impedance, because it can ensure that the data that gets across is valid, otherwise it's invalid. Like if it's low impedance, you get all these reflections. If it's too low, you get all these like signals bouncing back and forth, and what ends up happening is you get errors due to reflections in the signal. So this is the difference. These are the two factors. So if you're overclocking RAM or like if you're running high impedance, you could basically damage your DRAM because you're going to overheat your RAM. You're going to tune the resistor up so much that the electrical signal basically dies off. But if you keep trying to pump more voltage or current through a high impedance DRAM, you're going to burn it up. You're basically going to make it run really hot. Think of it like a stove, like an electrical stove. That thing is, the burner is literally a giant resistor. Because this is basically what we're doing. So you're going to cook your RAM if you run high impedance. However, you're not going to have a lot of errors. Which means you're not going to be blue screening, but you're going to have problems with the system even like running, because the DRAM just won't function correctly. So in this scenario, with this, it doesn't post. it fails to post. And it will have to retrain, or worst case scenario, you have to clear CMOS and start over. So that's what happens when the impedance is too high. Now, when the impedance is too low, you can typically boot into Windows, but then the challenge becomes stability, because the RAM is the most important thing that needs to run stable. Like, I can't stress this enough. If the RAM is not stable, you could run into data integrity issues if you start writing data into RAM and then reading data from your RAM and saving it to your disk, like to your SSD. If that data from the RAM was bad, like if it was corrupted data, and then you now save and write that into your non-volatile storage, aka your M.2 drive or your hard drive or your SATA SSD, or worse, a RAID 0, that would be really bad. You could corrupt that application or that file, and you could basically lose data. You could lose your files, you could corrupt your games, your game saves could get corrupted. And what's even worse is if you're Steam syncing those and you sync the corrupted save file into the Steam cloud, now you have corrupted your Steam cloud save. So that's really, really bad. So you really don't want RAM to be unstable. So making sure you stability test RAM using things like memtest 86, memtest 64 is an easy one. It's free off of Tech Power Up. I mean, there's like a lot of them. Like OCCT can be used. Y-Cruncher. There's a whole bunch of applications that you can use to test RAM. But that is like the most important thing that needs to be tested for stability, because you do not want RAM to be unstable. Like, you could literally suffer data loss. I have corrupted a Windows installation because I ran unstable RAM last year. I was trying to run 128 gigs of RAM on my 13900K, and I made a video about it. It was the last video that I did with 128 gigs on Intel, and it was not stable. And I corrupted my operating system. It was not. I was running it at 5600, and it was not stable. And I corrupted my operating system. I had to reinstall Windows. It was a huge hassle to recover all the data. It was a huge pain and a big, big waste of time. So yeah. Unfortunately, the problem for Intel is you don't have access to all of these impedance parameters. Like, you cannot adjust ProctODT, you cannot adjust the drive strengths. Now, what I have found in the Gigabyte BIOS, there are some adjustment values. I have found them, but they're not enough. It doesn't have the same granularity. And the values are way different from the AMD ones. So I don't even really know where to start. Like, the AMD ones use RZQ, which is 240 ohms, and you just use the divider to adjust from there. So it's pretty straightforward. The Intel ones, there's weird numbers like 80. So they got like 80 ohms and like 120 ohms, and that's the baseline. So it's like, okay, and you can only go down. So you can't go up, you can only go down. So what that means is you can only introduce low impedance. You can't really do high impedance, which is fine, because typically what we need to do to get 4 sticks working is we have to lower the impedance. Typically, the name of the game is to do low impedance without running errors. That is the challenge. It's not about high impedance. High impedance is what you're not really... You never really touch high impedance on DDR5, from my own experience trying to overclock RAM. It's always about lowering the impedance while trying to maintain stability and not running into errors. So you don't want to introduce reflections, because that's what causes the errors. So anyway, that answers the question that I get all the time. Like, what do I do? You know, I put 128 gigs of RAM and I can't run my RAM at 6000 and I get a BSOD. What do I do? Well, you got to tune this. You got to tune this. And you have, basically, the name of the game is lower the impedance as much as possible without running into errors. That's how you get 4 sticks of dual rank in a 2 DPC config working. So this whole section might end up becoming its own video because this, like, there's not a lot of content on the internet talking about this. Just straight up. Like, I think this is probably like one video on the internet talking about impedance. How do you know if it's reflecting? If you get errors. That's why you have to stability test. You won't know unless you get errors. Errors happen due to the reflection. So if you're getting errors in like Y-Cruncher, if you're like the easiest way, like without even stability testing, if you open up a YouTube video in the browser and all of a sudden you're watching the YouTube video and all of a sudden that browser tab crashes, or all of a sudden Chrome's like, oh snap, something happened. That is a dead giveaway that there are reflections going on in the RAM. Like straight up, that's a memory instability problem right there. So, yeah, there's like, if you're asking how to actually see the reflections, the only way to really do that would be to somehow physically wire an oscilloscope and to probe the RAM. You have to probe the RAM because these values, these RZQ values that we're changing, we're actually modifying values on the DIMMs themselves. Like, here's the thing. Overclocking RAM by adjusting these values, this is literally changing stuff on the RAM. Because this is the RAM's values. This is not the CPU. Like, all the CPU stuff is over here. Like, the CPU stuff is the voltages. The impedance stuff is the RAM itself. So this is literally RAM overclocking. Like, this is RAM overclocking. This is not like CPU overclocking. This is really, really RAM overclocking. That's the reason why I was saying earlier, if you're running like high impedance, very high impedance, the RAM heats up. The RAM will overheat, not the CPU, not the motherboard. The RAM is overheating because we're actually modifying values that apply to the resistors to the RAM's actual digital circuit. That's why. So the thing with AMD is AMD is the only platform that can actually do 4 sticks of dual rank reliably because the RZQ values are all in the BIOS. Now I'm still trying to get the Intel equivalent working. It's just way harder because, first of all, the Intel memory controller is way more hit or miss. So not only do you have to take into account the RAM, you also have to focus on what your IMC can actually do. With the Ryzen CPU, it's pretty much, you don't have to worry about your IMC. It's pretty much going to do like 8,000. It's just like, what do you do when you're running a lot of RAM? You know what I mean? Like, you cannot do 8,000 with a lot of RAM. Like 192 gigs at 8,000 or 128 gigs at 8,000. That's not going to happen. That's not going to happen on AMD, and that's definitely not going to happen on Intel. Because Intel, it's hard enough to get 8,000 stable with 2 sticks of memory. So you can forget about 4 sticks of memory. So the goal with Intel is to try to get it to run as close to 6,000 as possible. But it's realistically, like, I would be happy if I could get Intel, if I could get 128 gigs on Intel running at 5,600, because that's what I tried to do last year, and I want to try to revisit that. I would be happy with that. I would accept 5,600 for 128 gigs on Intel, because that's already an overclock. Because Intel's official spec is 3,600, so to me that's still a win. I mean, it's not as big of a win as it is on like AMD, because with AMD, if you can clock it to 6,000 and you're running 128 gigs of RAM, like, that's huge, because you're in that gear 1 ratio. You know, like U clock equals mem clock. You got a lot of RAM and it's running at a high speed. Like, that is a massive win if you can pull that off. But that's not easy, because that requires knowledge of these parameters. You know, like the RZQ and what that means, and how to avoid reflections by lowering the impedance. So, because the default the default proc ODT is something like 60 ohms or like 55 ohms. It's like a higher number. All these numbers are lower numbers than what you would typically see. Like 30 ohms is the lowest value you can program in the BIOS. Like you can't manually plug in a number. There's a table, there's a drop down, you have to choose one of the numbers in the BIOS. In fact, actually, we should probably show that in the video. Hey, Alex. Yeah, it has been a while. Yeah, well, I've been doing a lot of DDR5 videos recently because there's a lack of knowledge, especially when it comes to 4 sticks. Like, everything that I've seen when it comes to DDR5 is always 2 sticks. But no one talks about 4 sticks. And 4 sticks, and the reason why they don't talk about it in the OC community is because it's like super hard to do. And you're not going to hit very high speeds. You know, like the best you're going to get is like 6,000 on AMD. If you really know what you're doing and you're really lucky. On like, and when I'm talking about 128 gigs of RAM, just to clarify, 128 gigs or 192 gigs at 6,000 DDR5. That's what we're talking about. Now that is actually more challenging than like 8,000 with 2 sticks. So, but we like to do the challenging stuff on here. So anyway, what I should probably do is, hold on, let's bring back the browser. Where'd it go? Oh, it probably shrunk. Oh no, it's too big now. Yeah, that always happens every time I share like CPU Z or Zen timings or something. It always like, I always gotta resize the browser thing. It always becomes too big, or it becomes too big. You're still on AM4. Motherboard plus DDR5 is the next upgrade. Yeah. Well, the thing is, we're pretty close to Zen 5, so if I were in your position, I'd probably wait for Zen 5. Because it's probably coming out, it's definitely Q3, so it's not that much longer. All the BIOSes on the AM5 motherboards already have support for it. But see, so I just want to show briefly here. Change the BIOS. There we go. Here are the RZQs. See all these RZQs? Just like what Zen Timings was showing, and just like what this was showing. Now, the cool thing about the ASRock motherboard, I think ASRock, their BIOS team, has done a really good job at doing a lot of the legwork in testing and verifying what actually works, depending on how much RAM is installed. And is it single rank versus dual rank? Is it 2 sticks versus 4 sticks? Like, their BIOS team already kind of has, for some reason, the BIOS for the ASRock motherboard seems to have enough intelligence to automatically select specific numbers, because I didn't do any of this. Like what you guys see on the screen here, ASRock literally programmed these numbers, like including that 53.3 ohms. It automatically set this when I went to go and set the XMP profile or the Expo or whatever the profile was, the JDEC profile, whatever it was I chose from the preset. ASRock automatically like applies these 4. Like it didn't do these other ones; those are still auto. Because over here on the left, this is what it initialized to. Like when it first did the initial training, like it chose these. But when I went in the BIOS, I override that because I chose a specific profile. So now it automatically programs these. Now I don't know if these come from the XMP profile or the Expo profile. I doubt it, because if you load this on Gigabyte doesn't show you this. Like it doesn't put these. It says auto for everything. So I feel like ASRock, their BIOS team, has done some of the legwork at figuring out what is the correct number, or what is the ballpark that this needs to be in to run based off of that profile. So that's really good. But what I end up doing here is I override that. I manually choose specific values. So you guys can see here the options for the RTT nominal read is either auto or completely off or 1-to-1, because remember what I said earlier, RZQ means 240 ohms. So RZQ right here by itself, in parentheses, they put 240 ohms. Then RZQ divided in half equals 120 ohms. So these are, just like with memory overclocking, this is a divider. What we are applying here is a divider to the resistor value, to the reference resistor. So what you want to do is, like I said earlier, you want to lower the resistance so that the IMC signal going into the RAM has a better shot at making it all the way through all that RAM, because we're running 4 sticks of dual rank RAM. So that's the reason why we have to lower the impedance, not raise the impedance. So what I'm doing here is I'm looking at the fact that it chose 60, but I don't think 60 will be stable. Or I want to try to set a value that will actually either give me an error quick, so I know I need to like raise it, or because I want it to post. The goal is I want it to actually post so I can actually try to test it in Windows, or I can actually test the stability of the RAM. So I don't want it to be too high, because then it just won't post, because there's too much resistance for the CPU's signal to make it through the RAM. So here we're going to go with 48, see? So I'm actually... Okay, so I guess I kept the 60 up there, 48. And this one I think I'm probably going to do like 34. Yeah, I do 34. So notice here, the default was 60. ASRock's telling me, hey, you're probably going to need 53.3. So it's almost like ASRock is already moving in the right direction. Like it's already trying to recommend a lower impedance value for stability, or for the ability to post at least. So, but I think I modify this one also. Let me see what I do. I think I put it down to like 48. So I lowered a little bit because it was 53. ASRock said 53. I'm like, no, let's go lower, 48. And then these are already kind of low. Like if you see, these are already 34 and 30. So I think what I do is I change them from auto to the exact same numbers. And this is on a 7950 X3D and an ASRock Steel Legend. Yeah, I basically just hard code the same numbers so that when it trains, because I have these here, I don't want those autos to like change because I changed these other ones. So I want those to stay the same. And this works. What I'm showing you guys, these were the settings that actually worked for me. So 30, 29, blah, blah, blah. We're trying to program the RAM to 6,000. Now, what's not shown in the video right here, now notice it says 1.35. I forgot to record the part where I lower this to 1.2. But you'll see in, let me skip to the end. Yeah, you guys can see in the end of the video, Zen timing shows 1.25 on your memory voltages. So we got 1.18 on VSOC. We have 1.25 for VDD, VDDQ, VDDIO. And then those are the resistor values that we set. And we're at 6,000 gear 1 with 4 sticks of memory. So you can see 4 out of 4 DIMMs right there. So that's basically what you need to do. I mean, the trick is in this. It's these values, not subtimings, not voltages. Now, after you get this stable, then you can go and try to change the subtimings or do the build-zoid timing optimization or whatever, and then again you have to test stability. But this is actually how to get 4 sticks of a lot of RAM working. So, and unfortunately, we can't do all these modifications on Intel's motherboard. That's the reason why I haven't put out Intel content, because I don't have access to all the impedance values. There's like 2 different ones, and they're really weird. It's like 80, and it's like, I think it's like 80 ohms, and that's basically it. And you can only either go really, really high or really, really low. And I don't know. I have to play around with it more. But I still need to figure out how to get 8,000 mega transfers working on Intel because I can't get mine to boot. So, anyway, that's probably going to be it for this stream. I don't think there's anything else. Was there one thing that we were going to talk about? I forgot. Was there like another? Zen 5 families detailed, Granite Ridge, desktop. We talked about this before. I think we're probably just going to skip this. But this is like the last thing. But I think we've talked about like Zen 5 for the past 2 or 3 weeks. Let me see. Is there anything else? Oh, there was one more thing. I don't know if it's worth mentioning this one, but one of Nvidia's partners rejected an RMA for a melted 4090. Says it's user error. Yeah, that's not going to go over well. So that doesn't look good. I don't know. What do you guys think? Do you think that's user error? Here's the thing that I want to say about this 4090 fiasco, because this is something that I have investigated pretty thoroughly back in February, January timeframe. What I wonder about is my question for the people who are having these melting connectors: how many times have you unplugged and replugged in the cable? Because remember that these have a limited number of times that they can be disconnected and reconnected. Because what actually has shown up under the microscope is in here. When you plug in the connector, I guess I got to use paint again to illustrate this. The pin is on the GPU side. So this is the GPU and this is the pin, or this is the connector. Let's say like this is the connector. When you plug in the plug has it's like a how do I draw this in 3D? This is gonna be really weird. So what am I trying to draw here? Like you guys get what I'm saying? Like the plug in goes over the pin. So this is the GPU. This is the plug. That's the pin. That's the pin. This is the socket in the connector that will connect over the pin. 2 cycles on 4080? I don't... Oh, wait. You personally 2 cycles? Because I can tell you right now, this concerns me. As anybody who does like benchmarking GPUs and stuff, this is the reason why I don't use the 4090 for CPU benchmarks. I don't use this is the reason why when I made that Final Fantasy video, so I recently did a CPU benchmark video for Final Fantasy Dawn Trail. I specifically used the XTX instead of the 4090 because I'm not going to like move the 4090 into a whole bunch of different motherboards over and over again. Now some people will like, oh well, you should just use the connector that came with the 4090. No, I don't do that. I use a direct cable with a power supply. So for me, I'd have to either disconnect from the 4090 or I'd have to disconnect from the power supply side. Either way, I'm screwed because I'm disconnecting this fabulous connector from either the PSU or the graphics card. So this is the reason why all my CPU benchmark videos are going to be using an XTX because that's the next best thing, and it doesn't have this stupid connector, so I don't have to worry about melting my 4090's connector. So that there you go. That's the reason. Otherwise, I would have used the 4090 like hands down for a CPU benchmark video. Because of this, I'm not taking any chances. So the XTX becomes the card of choice for benchmarking CPUs. So that being said, what I was going to say here is what they have found under the microscope. When this plug slides over the pin, the friction of coming into contact with the metal on metal, it actually scrapes and scratches little pieces of tin and I guess, I don't know, some kind of metal, but it's mostly tin that basically gets scraped off the pin. And you can imagine doing that, plugging and replugging, unplugging, plugging back in. Over time, you're going to scrape more and more of that tin off of these pins, and you're going to compromise the integrity of the adapter or the connector and the plug on the GPU side. So, a couple things. The one is the integrity of the pins weaken over time due to the scraping of metal on metal. The friction, I don't want to say scraping, but that's literally what happens. The friction between the metal on the plug side and the metal pin on the GPU side causes friction and causes degradation of the GPU's pin and the plug connector's plug. So that's number one that could be causing this problem. So the question I have for people who have melted connectors, how many times did you unplug and plug in the GPU? The other thing, which I think actually might be the real reason, is under the microscope. And I think this was Derbauer, maybe Gamers Nexus. Somebody looked at these pins under a microscope, and they have found foreign debris inside on the physical contacts. Foreign debris on the contacts on the connector. So, my other question now to those who have melted connectors, what is the sort of environment that the PC is installed in? Because, for example, if there's a lot of dust in the case, if there's dust in the case and you unplug the cable and you leave it unplugged for a while or whatever, like let's say you're doing a power supply swap or something, you unplug it and you let it sit for a day or two, and it's in a very dusty environment, or it's in an environment where there's pets. There could be cat dander. That's a pretty common one. That stuff could make its way into the area where the pins reside, or into the plug on the cable side. Now, these foreign particles do not have the same level of temperature tolerance as the actual physical metal. So I'm more inclined to believe that these melted connectors could actually be caused by foreign debris causing high temperatures and areas of thermal resistance to give way on the connector, therefore leading to these blast sites where there's micro damage due to foreign debris stains on the metal pin or on the plug connector side. And at higher temperatures, this stuff degrades and causes damage to the surrounding area, and that could further compromise things like the plastic housing. And if the plastic starts melting or failing, that could then cause, it's a cascading effect. You basically get damage to the plastic housing. That causes higher thermal resistance on the metal, because if the plastic starts getting on the metal, then you now have the metal running hotter in certain areas. You create these hot zones where it's running hotter, and the rest is history. It just degrades further from there, and you end up with this. Because notice that it's always the high power pins. It's always the high power pins. It's never the ground pin side where the majority of the damage is. So it's almost like, could it be foreign debris versus the scraping of the metal due to the physical connection between the cable and the plug, or the connector itself? So I tend to think that it actually could be foreign debris that's causing this. But I'm not sure. That's why the questions that I would ask anyone who's run into this problem is, what is the environment that the PC is installed in? Do you have any pets? How many times have you disconnected the cable? And the other question too, obviously, this would be an even more obvious question, is do you run your games at uncapped frame rates? Do you run your GPU overclocked? What is the rated power supply? What type of cable are you using? Is the GPU using a native plug? Can it actually go to 600 watts? These are the sort of questions that I would ask, because I don't think that it's user error, guys. Like, the fact that this keeps happening, I would like to think that somebody who spends $2,000 on a graphics card knows how to put together a PC. So I don't think that all these cases are user error. To me, that just seems kind of absurd. Just use the adapter and leave it attached to the GPU. Just disconnect from the 8-pin side. Well, that was said way earlier. Yeah. I don't know. This is not good. It's not good. The other thing that I'm curious to know is, like, which one fails more? The ones that follow Nvidia's style or the ASUS style? Because ASUS, the Strix, flips it around. They put aren't they the ones that do the ASUS one, the ground pins are down here near the PCB, and the sense wires are up here on the top. Because technically this is upside down, because this is like inside a case. So the PCB is up here. ASUS Strix, the overpriced $2,000 waste of money card, that one is like flipped the other way around. And I mean, I've seen some of Northridge Fix's videos on that. And man, he's always got an ASUS Strix that he has to fix. Like, those things are so bad. Like, I don't know if that's worse or better, but whatever. Like, it may not even matter, but the ASUS one is different. To me, if it was user error, we'd have seen similar issues with the 6+2. Seems exclusive to the 4090. Well, apparently, it's not exclusive to the 4090, though, because the 4080s, it doesn't happen as often on the 4080, but he has fixed 4080s with melted connectors. But definitely the 4090 is way more common. And again, that's because it has a much higher power limit. It's a 450 watt TDP card, and if you overclock it, you can actually go well above that. So I kind of think that's the reason why. 4080 has a power limit of 320 watts, if I'm not mistaken. 320 watts. So it has way more margin, but look, you can overclock the 4080 above 350 watts. You can overclock it to 400 watts. And I don't know. It's not good. I don't know why the 3090 Ti doesn't have this problem, though. 3090 Ti uses the same connector, and as far as I know, there weren't that many reports of it having this issue. And there were enough of them in the field that if there was a problem, you would have seen it. But it doesn't happen on the 3090 Ti. The 3090 Ti, though, has some extra it has some extra circuitry on the PCB. My understanding is the 3090 Ti has extra circuitry on the PCB, not on the connector. The connector is the same, but the PCB has some stuff that helps load balance across the actual physical pins. Like these pins in the middle, these are the ones that heat up, not these. These are the ground pins. The middle ones here are the ones that run the high current. But the 3090 Ti is so good that it has extra pizza sauce on the PCB that basically tells the system we got to load balance evenly across these 6 pins so that we don't burn up the connector. I don't think the 4090 has that circuitry. The 4090 is supposed to function strictly on the sense wires, these 4 wires up here, because it's following the full spec. So it's basically the complete spec, whereas the 3090 Ti physically has the connector and it does have the sense wires. But remember, the 3090 Ti came out in an era where there were no power supplies that had this physical plug. I mean, even when the 4090 came out, there were no power supplies that had this plug. The power supplies that supported this natively, they came out literally like a month or 2 after the 4090 launched. So keep that in mind. The 3090 Ti, because it came out earlier in that year, it was like March or something of the same year of the 4090, and that's why I'm telling people, don't buy a Super. You're going to get scammed because the 50 series is coming like in the same year. At least this one's successor is. So 3090 Ti had extra circuitry to manually load balance across the pins regardless of whether the sense wires were present or not. So maybe it's potentially an issue with the sense wires, the current draw not properly load balancing, but then that would definitely prove that the problem is an Nvidia problem, not a user error or a issue with foreign debris or metal getting scraped from the connection or whatever other theories that I have that could be causing the problem. So yeah, that's unfortunate because this is a lot of money and this is a super annoying headache to have to deal with if this happens. Sense pins issue seems most logical to me. So you're kind of on board with that idea? Like the 3090 Ti doesn't run into this problem because it uses the sense wires manually. Like it does load balancing manually. Because I'll tell you guys, like my 3090 Ti has the same physical connector. I have plugged my 3090 Ti into a power supply that uses the native cable from the power supply directly into the 3090 Ti, and it works exactly the same as the 4090. I have also used the 3090 Ti cable that comes with the Founders Edition in the box, and that one doesn't have the sense wires at all. Whereas the 4090 will not even, your computer won't even post if you plug in the cable without these 4 sense wires connected. So there's definitely differences in the electronic circuitry between the 3090 Ti and the 40 series GPUs. Because 3090 Ti works without the 4 pins. And I've never had a problem with it. And I might add, the 3090 Ti at stock pulls more power typically than a 4090. So you would think that the 3090 Ti is the one that is the most prone to this problem because it uses more power at stock than the 4090. And yet you don't really see reports of it happening on that card. Improper contact of the pins will make them overheat either due to the connection not plugged in all the way or due to debris. See, yeah, I think it could be debris. I honestly think it's debris. I remember when whoever it was, Gamers Next or somebody, they were looking at the X-ray photos of the connector, and they pointed out like there's foreign debris. I was like, I don't know if I would just sweep that to the side as, you know, a no issue. Like, that could actually be a significant problem with foreign debris in there. You can't even find a melted 3090 Ti. Yeah, so who knows? Like, well, I think what's going to happen with 50 series is one of two things, or maybe both things. I think whatever magical circuitry the 4090 Ti had that gave it that protective aura from this problem, Nvidia might do the same thing with the 50 series, or they'll apply that same circuitry to the 50 series as a failsafe for load balancing. The other thing that I could see happening, which could probably be the more likely scenario, is add a second one of these connectors. Literally just put two connectors. You solve the problem if you put two connectors, because then you load balance across two physical connectors as opposed to load balancing across the pins. So what they could end up doing is, let's delete this. So for example, and I think we talked about this in a previous live stream. Like if they put, like, if here's, why is this orange? If this is the 30, like if this is the 5090 PCB and this is the connector, this puny little connector, the way it works today, let's just say this is 4090. This is RTX 4090. So you got your one rinky-dink little connector here, you know, that's holding all that power in across 6 little pins that are so thin, micro Molex, or micro, isn't it micro pin Molex something? Whatever, it's microfit, I think, Molex. So you got one, okay, you got one, that's not what I want to do. You have the cable, and then if you're using the adapter, you have like you got 4 8 pins. You know what I mean? You got 4 8 pins. You got all these 8 pins hanging off of this adapter. So, this is how it is on 4090. If, with the 5090, what I can see them doing is simply add another one of these. Just put another one on here. Yes, it's going to look uglier. Who cares? And instead, they'll do 2 8 pins off of this one and 2 8 pins off of the other one. So you'll still have like your adapter, but it'll come with the adapter that goes on the 4070. You know what I mean? It'll come with 2 of those adapters that go on the 4070. That's what it'll do. That's how they'll fix it. Watch. They're going to either they're going to go back to the standard 8-pin like AMD and just avoid the problem forever by just doing that. But I don't think they're going to do that. Because Nvidia is Nvidia, and they want their special, like, we do this differently. You know, we do all this stuff. We do all this stuff with the black box. You can't modify it, whatever. So they're going to do it this way. And this will solve the problem. Because look, if you do it this way, this is what? 150 watts. 150 watts, 150 watts, and 150 watts. So you know what that means? One connector, max 300 watts. The other connector, max 300 watts. There's your 600 watt TDP. So the likelihood of these trash connectors having problems is significantly reduced if the maximum overclocked power draw is 300 watts. instead of 600 watts. You know what I'm saying? I mean, it's still better than 450 watts. Because technically, the stock power limit, the TDP on the 4090 is 450 watts. So, this is still significantly better. In fact, this is better than the 4080. This is less power draw per connector than the 4080, because the 4080 is like 320 to 350. So, it's still better. So yeah. Because realistically, this is the maximum. Like, realistically, you're talking what? Like, if the thing typically pulls around like 320 to 380, so you divide that in half, you know, like, you're at what? 180 watts or so. You're at like 190 watts, realistically. Or maybe 200 watts on the other one. You know what I'm saying? And that's more of your typical operation. So it shouldn't be a problem if they put 2 of those connectors on there. But I don't know. To me, it looks so dumb. Like all these like octopus cables just hanging off of the thing. It looks so stupid. So the native cable, it's the problem with doing this is all those power supplies out there today that have the native cable, they only have one native cable. That means you're going to have to do something like, you're going to have like one, you're going to have to use the adapter on your power supply, and then you have the native you have the native cable on the other side. So it's I don't know, it's just going to make it look dumb. It's just gonna make it janky looking. People will have to buy another new power supply that has 2 of these. So it's like people are gonna have to buy a new power supply that has 2 native cables so they can cable manage it down to the power supply. Power supply is like down here, guys, but you guys get what I'm saying. So anyway, that's probably what they'll do. I mean, that'll be like the easiest fix. It's a better failsafe than putting the 3090 Ti circuitry on there. We need if someone still melts a dual. I don't know. I don't think. I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen, but I think this, like, if this is what they do, this is a clear indication that the problem was probably due to some inefficient load balancing across the pins, and they put a second one in there to completely fix any potential problem with certain games or applications not load balancing correctly. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that one would have a problem. Unless that card can somehow pull like 1200 watts. Like if it can pull 600 watts per connector, which I highly doubt. If it does, then it could run into the problem. Because I've already done the math. I have a whole video about this where I do the math, and I do what was it, the degrading factor, on the pins, and I calculated that there's very little margin for the 4090 at 450 watt TDP to be safe, basically. Now I did the same math for a 4080. And it had way more margin, but it was still kind of low compared to a standard 8-pin. It was way lower than a standard 8-pin. So that's why I feel like with standard 8-pins, you can unplug them, replug them so many times. It's not a big deal. There can be foreign debris in there, and it's still not a big deal because the pins are so much larger. There's so much more surface area to dissipate the heat, even if there's degraded areas on an individual pin. So same goes for the connector. So that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's probably gonna be it for this stream. Someone was asking earlier if I can join the chat thing. Yeah, I could probably, but we'll see. I don't know. If I have time, I'll join, or maybe this weekend. Seems 666 watt mode is max. Is that a thing? Is that a thing that the Galax can do? Is that for real? 660 watts is max? Anyway, that's going to be it, guys. I hope you guys enjoy the stream. If you are new to the channel and you like this sort of in-depth content that you can't really find some of the stuff on the internet, like especially the resistance stuff on the RAM, feel free to like the video. And if you really like the content and if you want to pay attention to the video uploads, get subscribed to the channel, hit the notification bell icon so you'll know when I do a live stream. Because sometimes we do live streams on the weekend. Not every weekend, but sometimes we do. Usually either on a Friday or a Saturday. I'll try to do a live stream. And that's pretty much it. We'll do more videos on RAM. We'll do videos on other things too. Like, I've been meaning to cover cabling. Like, there's been a lot of talk on my Discord channel recently for OLED. So I wanted to address like high refresh, high resolution for maybe something like an OLED. So there's probably going to be a video about that in the near future, specifically for HDMI and DisplayPort, and kind of like what you need to avoid things like monitor flickering and things like that, because that's something that people have messaged me, like, how do I fix monitor flickering? So anything like that, that's what we cover. So if you like this content, do subscribe. It does help me out. It does help me feel motivated to keep making this type of content, because some of this stuff, I don't have to research a whole lot because I already kind of know a lot of it. But depending on the topic, sometimes I do need to actually do more research, and then that basically compounds the amount of time and effort put into making the content. So I do appreciate it if you want to subscribe to the channel. That would be much appreciated. And as always, guys, I will catch you next week on the Thursday of every week of every month. We haven't missed an episode yet so far, and we're now at episode 59. So next week will be episode 60. I'll see you Thursday, and until then, take care, and I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks.